In the misty city of Hangzhou, where old temples stood side by side with modern high-rises, a 10-year-old Muslim girl named Amina lived with her parents Malik and Lian Hua. Her father, a Sudanese convert to Islam, had met and married Lian Hua, a Chinese woman with a gentle heart and quiet strength. Together they built a home filled with compassion, Quranic wisdom, and cultural harmony, though they were a minority in a society steeped in traditions not their own. Amina, despite her age, was unlike most children. She had memorized large portions of the Quran, could speak Mandarin fluently, and possessed a mind that asked deep, piercing questions. Her mother often said that Amina didn't just read the Quran, she lived it. The way she treated the poor, greeted her neighbors, and helped her mother during food drives in the city park all radiated sincerity far beyond her years. One rainy afternoon, the city's largest cultural hall was buzzing with excitement. A famous interfaith forum was taking place, drawing monks, professors, spiritual leaders, and curious citizens. Among them was the revered monk Wen Zhao, a senior Buddhist monk known throughout Asia for his books on inner peace and spiritual philosophy. He stood tall in his orange robes, wise yet unbending, respected yet proud. The hall was packed. Rows of chairs were filled. The scent of incense and the low hum of intellectual conversation filled the air. Malik and Lian Hua brought Amina along, intending to simply observe. But destiny had other plans. As the discussions proceeded peacefully, monk Wen Zhao eventually took the microphone. His speech, elegant and poised, subtly criticized religions that, in his words, restricted the soul with laws instead of freeing it with emptiness. Though he didn't name any faith, it was clear what he meant. He praised freedom from rules and warned against doctrines that chained the spirit with fear. Amina's small hand gripped her mother's tightly. Her eyes widened, not in anger, but in discomfort. She leaned in and whispered, "Ummi, can I say something?" Her mother hesitated, but saw the calm certainty in Amina's eyes and nodded. "If you speak, do so respectfully, with wisdom." When the moderator invited audience questions, Amina stood up and walked toward the microphone. A few chuckled. Others were merely curious. What could a child possibly contribute in a room full of scholars? But when she spoke, silence fell. "My name is Amina," she said clearly in Mandarin. "I am a Muslim. I have a question for Monk Wenzo. Is peace found by removing all rules, or by following the right ones?" The monk raised his eyebrows. "Rules can be cages," he said. "Real peace comes when the soul is free." Amina responded gently. "Then should people hurt others if it makes them feel free?" The room froze. When Zhao hesitated, then said, "No, of course not." "Then that's a rule," Amina continued. "A rule not to harm. So maybe not all rules are cages. Maybe they are bridges." Even the cameras turned toward her. Phones were lifted. No one expected this. Not from a 10-year-old. And Amina wasn't done yet. Monk Wen Zhao stood silently, eyes narrowed. Not in offense, but in contemplation. The hall remained frozen in awe. Not a single cough or whisper disrupting the weight in the air. Amina's voice, though soft, had cut through layers of rehearsed dialogue like sunlight piercing a fogged window. The monk finally replied, his tone slower, more thoughtful. "Rules that protect, yes, perhaps they have value. But many religions use rules to control minds." Amina tilted her head slightly, eyes focused but respectful. "May I ask, venerable monk, does Buddhism believe in karma?" Wen Zhao nodded. "Certainly. Karma teaches that our actions, good or bad, return to us." "Then karma itself is a rule," Amina responded. "An invisible one, but still a rule. It guides behavior with consequences. In Islam, we call that accountability before Allah, so maybe we're not so different." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the audience. And when we Muslims pray, she continued, we stand side by side, black and white, rich and poor, Chinese, Arab, African. There is no ranking, no caste, just hearts lined up for one purpose. Doesn't that sound like unity? Monk Wenzhou couldn't respond immediately. His lips parted slightly, but no words emerged. His eyes drifted from Amina to the crowd, then back to the little girl who stood with more conviction than many adults he had encountered. He had debated in Europe, India, Thailand, but never had a question landed like this. Amina went on gently, I know you didn't mean to hurt us, but when you said outside religions bring separation, maybe you didn't see the unity they bring in our prayers, in our charity, in our patience. My mother is Chinese. My father is Sudanese. Islam didn't separate them. It brought them together. The crowd erupted in quiet claps, respectful, reverent. Some wiped away tears. Even the moderator, earlier unsure about letting a child speak, bowed his head slightly toward her in acknowledgement. But the most remarkable reaction came from two Buddhist nuns seated in the front row. They turned to each other, eyes glistening. One whispered, "This girl, she carries light in her chest." Amina stepped back from the microphone, bowed politely, and returned to her seat beside her mother. Lian Hua gently kissed the top of her daughter's head, but said nothing. She didn't need to. Amina already knew what that kiss meant. As the event drew to a close, Monk Wenzhou addressed the audience again, but his voice was no longer commanding. It was humbled. I came here today to speak, but I leave with more to listen to. Perhaps I have spoken too soon about things I do not fully understand. Later that night, as the guests slowly filed out of the cultural hall, Monk Wenzhou sat alone, still processing the moment. He stared at the empty stage as if it were a mirror reflecting the part of himself he hadn't examined in years. From the side of the room, Malik, Amina's father, approached respectfully. "She didn't mean to challenge," he said softly, "only to clarify." The monk looked up, and for the first time in the evening he smiled. Not the polite smile of diplomacy, but a tired, genuine smile. "I know," he said. "Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive on the lips of great teachers, but in the question of a child." 3 days passed, but the reverberations of the debate did not fade. Across China, and even beyond, clips of Amina's quiet, profound exchange with Monk Wenzhou began circulating across social media platforms. The video was shared on Weibo, WeChat, YouTube, and eventually reached English-speaking audiences with translated subtitles. The title was simple but captivating. 10-year-old Muslim girl silences monk with truth. The comment sections were divided. Some praised Amina as a gifted soul and light in dark times, while others questioned how a child could speak so eloquently about faith. A few accused the video of being staged. Others were simply stunned into silence. But while the online world buzzed, pressure began to mount in the physical world. One morning, Malik found an official letter taped to the front door. It was from the local district office. Their weekly food distribution program in the city park, a peaceful community effort run by Malik and Lian Hua, was suspended due to lack of permit compliance. It was a small blow, but it carried a message. Soon after, neighbors who used to greet them warmly began avoiding eye contact. One bakery owner quietly returned the money Malik had given for a standing order and said, "I think it's better we don't continue business, just for now." Even at Amina's school, things shifted. The principal called Lian Hua in for a meeting, his tone cautious and diplomatic. "We respect all faiths," he said, "but perhaps Amina's participation in public religious dialogues should be minimized. We don't want her targeted. The climate is sensitive." Lian Hua stared at him. "My daughter answered a question she didn't initiate. She spoke with calmness and respect. Isn't that the kind of example we want in our children?" The principal sighed. "I understand. I really do. But we're under pressure from above. That evening, Malik gathered his family. They sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the warm scent of jasmine tea lingering in the air. I won't lie to you, he said gently. This is not going to be easy. Some people are afraid of truth, especially when it comes from someone unexpected. A child, a Muslim child at that, speaking so confidently, it rattles their comfort. Amina sat quietly, her musaf resting in her lap. Abi, did I do something wrong? Malik reached over and held her hand. No, my jewel, you did everything right. But sometimes the world isn't ready for truth when it comes wearing innocence. Lian Hua placed her arm around her daughter's shoulders. We can pause if you like. You don't have to carry this weight. Amina shook her head. I'm not tired, Umi, just sad. Why does truth make people angry? No one had an answer right away. Outside, the wind whispered through the streets of Hangzhou, as if the city itself were unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Monk Wenzhao sat in his private study, his sanctuary for decades. The shelves were stacked with sacred Buddhist texts, philosophical writings, and ancient scrolls. But tonight, he ignored them all. On the screen of his tablet, he replayed the debate with Amina. Again and again. Her questions echoed in his mind, gentle but piercing. They did not accuse, they invited. His disciple, Jian Hui, entered quietly, bringing tea. Sifu, you haven't slept since the event, Jian said, concern in his eyes. I'm not sick, Wenzhao replied, still staring at the screen. Just disturbed. Because of the debate? No, Wenzhao whispered. Because of the mirror she held up. All my life I've taught about detachment, about silencing the ego. But this child, she spoke of God's love as a rule, not to restrain, but to guide. And it didn't feel oppressive. It felt warm, Jian finished. Yes, and I've never felt that from words before. Jian paused. Do you want to talk to her again? Wenzhao finally looked up, his voice almost a whisper. Yes, not to debate, but to understand. The monk's journey was no longer about proving a point. It had become a search, a thirst that would not let him rest. The following week, Malik received an envelope bearing the seal of the Cultural Harmony Foundation, a neutral organization known for fostering interfaith understanding in China. Inside was a formal letter. We cordially invite Mr. Malik, Mrs. Lian Hua, and their daughter Amina to participate in a closed interfaith dialogue session. This meeting will be private, involving select scholars and spiritual leaders seeking deeper engagement across faiths. Your presence is requested at the Harmony Center, Thursday, 10 a.m. There were no media mentions, no public promotions, just silence. Malik was hesitant. After the backlash from the last event, this invitation felt uncertain. But when Amina read the letter, her face lit up. Not with pride, but with purpose. I want to talk to Monk Wenzhao again, she said. Why? Her mother asked gently. Because I saw his eyes. He wasn't angry. He was lost. And when someone is lost, sometimes they just need one lamp to see the path again. At the Harmony Center, the atmosphere was entirely different from the previous debate. There were no flashing cameras, no applause, no crowded seats. Just a circular table, a soft-spoken moderator, and a few notable thinkers, among them Monk Wenzhao, dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in a simple gray tunic. He looked tired but alert. Beside him sat two other monks. On the other side, Malik, Lian Hua, and Amina entered with quiet grace. When Monk Wenzhao saw Amina, he stood up and bowed respectfully. I am honored you came, he said. His voice was softer than before. Amina returned the bow. Thank you for inviting us. Everyone sat. The moderator opened. Today, there are no titles, no debates, just honest questions between souls searching for understanding. After a moment of silence, Wenzhou spoke directly to Amina. "You asked me in the last forum whether peace can exist without rules, and I've thought about that every day since. I want to ask you now, not as a monk, but as a man. How do you know that God exists?" The room fell completely silent. Amina took a breath, and then answered with a calm, childlike honesty that carried unexpected depth. "Have you ever cried in the dark, when no one was there, and suddenly felt like someone hugged your heart? That warmth you couldn't explain?" Wenzhou nodded slowly. "I have," he whispered. "Many times." Amina continued, "I feel that warmth when I pray, when I read the Quran, when I do something right, even if no one sees. I've never seen God with my eyes, but I've felt Him, like light on my face on a cold morning. He's always there, even when I don't see Him." Wenzhou looked down at his hands. They were trembling. "And the rules you follow," he asked, "you don't find them heavy?" Amina shook her head. "Not at all. The rules are like signs on the road. If there are no signs, people crash. But if the signs are from someone who knows where the road ends, they're not traps. They're kindness." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the wind outside the tall windows seemed to pause. Then Wenzhou said quietly, "What if? I want to know your God, not to argue, just to learn." Malik leaned forward, his voice warm and welcoming. "If that's truly what you want, then we're here for you. Not as teachers, but as fellow travelers." The monk exhaled a deep, weary breath. "I don't know where my heart will land, but I do know I can't go back to who I was. I closed the door for too long, and now that the light is knocking, I don't want to shut it out again." That same evening, while the city of Hangzhou simmered down under sheets of soft rain, monk Wenzhou sat alone in his room at the monastery. The incense had long burned out. The scrolls on his wall, words of ancient Zen philosophy, now looked faded, not because of age, but because something inside him had shifted. Their once soothing silence was now met with the whispering echoes of a little girl's words. He looked at the small notebook in his hand, the one he carried with him since his early monkhood. That night, he scribbled just one line in the middle of a blank page. "Perhaps I've spent my life mastering emptiness, but I know nothing of fullness." He placed the notebook on the table, then opened the copy of the Quran in Mandarin translation that Amina had secretly gifted him after their second meeting. For hours, he read quietly, not scanning for flaws, not skimming for contradictions, but simply shouting, as a man in search of warmth in a cold room. Meanwhile, Malik and Lianhua were doing everything they could to keep Amina's spirit alive. Since her suspension from school, the house had grown quieter, but not heavier. Amina spent her days reviewing her Quran, reading stories of prophets, and sometimes just looking out of the window, reflecting. One morning, as she sat cross-legged near the window, Amina asked softly, "Abi, do you think I spoke too loudly?" Malik turned away from the kitchen and looked at her. "Loud words aren't measured by volume, Amina. They're measured by truth, and you spoke with clarity, not noise." "But why are people angry then?" Lianhua sat beside her. "Because truth, when it shines too brightly, makes those in darkness blink. It's not your fault. They're just not ready to open their eyes." Amina smiled faintly. "Then I'll just wait. Until they are." 3 days later, an envelope was slipped under their door. It bore no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, Amina's official notice of suspension from school, signed and sealed by the local education board. The reason? Environmental unsuitability. Lianhua read the paper in silence, then passed it to Malik. "They just want us to disappear," Malik said, shaking his head. But Amina wasn't shaken. She placed her mushaf on the table, stood up, and said quietly, "If I can't go back to the classroom, then I'll make the world my classroom." Far away, in a quiet temple perched on a hill, Wen Zhao had reached a breaking point. News of his growing interest in Islam had spread rapidly, first as rumors, then as accusations. Some of his closest students resigned. The Buddhist Federation issued a formal statement denouncing ideological betrayal. His books were pulled from spiritual libraries across the country. Even the temple elders, who once called him the Enlightened One, now refused to greet him. And yet, amidst this storm of rejection, Wen Zhao felt something he had never known before: peace. Every night he retreated to his hut in the Yandang Mountains. There, with only the Quran, a notebook, and candlelight, he wept. Not tears of sorrow, but of awakening. One night he wrote, "Truth isn't something to win. It's something to surrender to. I spent decades meditating to hear my own soul, and now I hear a whisper stronger than all my chanting, La ilaha illallah." Back in Hangzhou, Malik reached out to an old friend, Farid, a Muslim journalist from Shanghai. He came quietly, without cameras, without drama, just a notebook and a voice recorder. Sitting across from Amina, Farid asked, "Why did you speak that day?" Amina shrugged, "Because no one else was going to. And when I heard something untrue about Islam, my heart wouldn't stay silent." Farid smiled. "Do you know what courage is, Amina?" She nodded. "Doing the right thing, even when it's scary." Farid wrote an article that same week. It was published in English and Mandarin on international platforms under the title, "The Voice of Innocence: A Muslim Girl's Courage in Modern China." The article spread like wildfire. A Christian pastor in Canada reposted it. A Buddhist monk in Nepal wrote, "She reminded us that faith is not about power, it's about purity." But behind the digital wave, a darker one was forming in the shadows. The day after Amina's small video went viral, the world seemed to shift. International attention poured in. Muslim communities around the globe began sharing her story as a symbol of youthful courage and spiritual clarity. But at the same time, the backlash grew fiercer within China. The local authorities ramped up their surveillance of the family. Malik was questioned repeatedly at the local bureau, while Lian Hua's movements were quietly monitored. Yet despite the pressure, Amina remained serene. She had memorized the words of Allah, and each verse she whispered became her shield. "So verily with hardship there is ease." That was her favorite. And that morning, ease began to appear in a most unexpected way. Monk Wen Zhao returned to the city, not in silence and not in shame. He stood in front of a crowd of reporters outside the same cultural center where he once spoke against religion. His face was calm, his eyes clearer than ever. And then, with a microphone in hand and thousands watching live across the country, he declared, "I am no longer a monk. I no longer belong to any school of Buddhist thought. Today, I speak not as a leader, not as a philosopher, but as a seeker who has finally found peace. I have chosen Islam, not out of rebellion, not out of fear, but because the words of a 10-year-old girl pierced a darkness I didn't know I carried." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Cameras clicked, jaws dropped. Across social media, the announcement went viral. Amina's small voice had just changed the destiny of a man millions respected. Back at home, Amina sat quietly beside her mother as the live stream played. When she saw Monk Wen Zhao utter the Shahada on live TV, she covered her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. Lian Hua wrapped her arms around her. Malik whispered, "Allah works in the hearts, even those that once resisted." But this was just the beginning. Within days, Wen Zhao was stripped of all official positions. His home was vandalized again. Several Buddhist leaders condemned him as a traitor to his heritage. But he remained undeterred. With the help of Malik, he began quietly studying Islam and attending a nearby mosque under a new name, Abdul Hakim. He refused to go into hiding. "If the truth brings me hardship, then so be it," he told Malik one evening. "At least now I know who I am." Meanwhile, Amina was slowly allowed back into school, though her classmates still whispered. But she didn't mind. She had already seen what one voice can do. Weeks later, a major interfaith gathering took place in Malaysia. Unexpectedly, both Amina and Abdul Hakim were invited as honorary guests. At the event, Abdul Hakim delivered a powerful speech. "Once, I believed that truth lay in silence. Then I met a child who taught me that truth must be spoken. She reminded me that the heart knows before the mind can explain. I found Islam not in a book or lecture, but in her unwavering sincerity." When Amina was called to speak, she said only this: "I'm not special. I just listened to Allah and spoke what He taught me. You don't need to be old to carry wisdom. You just need to be honest with your heart." The audience stood in applause. By the end of the night, 3 Buddhist monks from Thailand who were present at the forum embraced Islam. One of them told the media, "I didn't come here to change my religion, but I came looking for peace, and I think I've found where it lives." Back in Hangzhou, a change was quietly blooming. People who once avoided Malik's family now greeted them with hesitant respect. A few even began asking sincere questions about the Quran. Farid, the journalist, wrote a follow-up article titled, "When Truth Comes in a Child's Voice." It was translated into 15 languages and reprinted in major publications worldwide. The government remained cautious, but eventually the pressure began to subside. They had learned that trying to silence the truth often only amplifies it. In the final scene, Amina sat on her rooftop under a sky sprinkled with stars. She held her mushaf close and whispered a dua under her breath. Her voice was soft, but it carried into the night. "Ya Allah, make me light for those who are lost. Let me be kind, not loud, brave, not proud, and always near to you." And far away, in a quiet mountain village, where a small masjid had just been built by new converts, Abdul Hakim stood with his hands raised to the sky, his eyes closed, tears flowing, not of regret, but of gratitude. This is not just a story of debate. It is a story of transformation, a story of how truth, no matter how small its voice, can awaken the world. And it all began with a little girl and her Quran.
In the quiet scholarly halls of Oxford University, the name Dr. William Langford echoed with reverence. A man of deep intellect, renowned across the Christian academic world, William was not merely a theologian, he was a force. His books on Christian apologetics were referenced in top seminaries, his lectures packed with eager students, and his debates admired for their razor-sharp logic. Born in Manchester and raised with a devout Anglican upbringing, he dedicated his entire life to studying the Bible in ancient Greek and Hebrew, seeking to defend its message against all criticism. For William, faith was not just belief, it was backed by language, history, and rigorous reasoning. Since his early 20s, he had been known as a fierce critic of other religions, especially Islam. He viewed Islamic theology as simplistic compared to the complex doctrines of Christianity, such as the Trinity and the concept of original sin. To him, Islam lacked the intellectual sophistication required to explain the divine. He debated Muslim scholars on stage, critiqued the Quran in his writings, and firmly believed that the Christian message was the pinnacle of divine revelation. He had no interest in reconsidering his beliefs, let alone embracing any alternate view. That was until a chance encounter at an academic conference in 2005 changed the direction of his life forever. At that conference, after presenting a paper on interfaith theology, William found himself engaged in a casual yet intense conversation with a Muslim scholar from Turkey. The man listened patiently to William's arguments, then calmly said, "If you believe the Quran is not from God, prove it. Study it in its own language. If it contains contradictions, you'll find them. But if it doesn't, what does that mean?" William smirked. To him, it was an easy challenge. "No book is perfect," he responded confidently. "Even the Bible has issues. historical gaps, textual inconsistencies. I'm sure the Quran has more. But something about the challenge stayed with him. It wasn't the tone of arrogance that often colored religious debates. It was the quiet certainty in the Muslim scholar's eyes. It was as if he knew that whoever took the Quran seriously would never walk away the same. William, out of both curiosity and his own confidence, decided to accept the challenge. He would read the Quran, not in English, but in classical Arabic. He wanted to uncover its flaws from the roots, to understand every nuance of the text. It was, for him, a scholarly endeavor, a project to expose what he thought would be theological loopholes. He began his study with excitement, even eagerness. He believed he'd dismantle the Quran's claims within a few months. But the more he read, the more something unexpected began to happen. The words didn't feel like ancient stories. They felt alive, reaching into his intellect, yes, but deeper still, unsettling something in his heart. And for a man who lived his whole life with books, ideas, and debates, this was a very new, very uncomfortable feeling. William's journey into the Quran was initially analytical, almost surgical. He started with translations, but quickly realized that he needed to study the book in its original language. So he took on a new academic goal, mastering classical Arabic. For someone already fluent in Hebrew and Greek, the challenge didn't seem too daunting. Within months, he was reading the Quran in Arabic, cross-referencing interpretations, studying its structure, and comparing it to ancient religious texts. His aim was singular: find flaws, contradictions, scientific errors, or historical inaccuracies. Anything that would prove the Quran to be a human invention. But the deeper he went, the more puzzled he became. The Quran wasn't behaving like other ancient texts. Its verses were not arranged chronologically or thematically, yet somehow they flowed with an emotional and philosophical coherence that defied typical literary structures. It wasn't just what was being said, it was how it was being said. He began to notice that many verses seemed to respond directly to the very doubts he carried in his heart. One verse in particular caught him off guard. Surah An-Nisa, verse 82. Do they not reflect upon the Quran? Had it been from anyone other than Allah, they would have found much contradiction in it. It felt like a personal challenge. He paused. That verse wasn't just philosophical, it was confrontational. It seemed to be addressing him directly, as if the Quran knew what he was trying to do. It was unlike any scripture he had ever read. The Bible, while revered in his heart, had been layered over the centuries with metaphor and editorial revisions. But the Quran, it was confident, bold, and uncompromising in its self-assertion. The more he tried to pull the Quran apart, the more it pulled him in. Instead of finding contradictions, he found consistency. Instead of vague metaphors, he found precision. Even the concept of God, the very idea of Tawheed, the absolute oneness and indivisibility of God, began to fascinate him. For years, he had defended the doctrine of the Trinity, believing it to be the most intellectually satisfying explanation of divine complexity. But now the purity and simplicity of Islamic monotheism began to make a different kind of sense, a deeper kind, one that required no complex formulations, no mathematical paradoxes. Just one God, absolute and eternal. He turned to Surah Al-Ikhlas, and its words struck him like lightning. Say, He is Allah the One, Allah the Eternal, Absolute. He begets not, nor is He begotten, and there is none like unto Him. 4 lines, and yet they dismantled years of theological architecture he had built and defended. How could something so simple be so powerful? How could it be so emotionally satisfying and theologically exact at the same time? Day by day, William found himself caught in a strange war between his logic and his heart. His academic training warned him to remain detached. But something within was changing. He wasn't just reading the Quran anymore. He was listening to it, and he could no longer pretend that it wasn't speaking back. By now, William Langford was no longer a casual observer of the Quran. What had begun as an academic pursuit was quickly transforming into a personal quest, one that unsettled him far more than he cared to admit. He had spent his entire adult life building an identity rooted in Christian theology, debating with unwavering conviction, defending doctrines like the Trinity with elegance and passion. Yet now, alone in his study with the Quran in front of him, He found himself questioning everything he once held as certain. He began to draw comparisons between the Bible and the Quran, not out of spite or superiority, but out of honest reflection. One glaring contrast stood out: preservation. He was stunned to learn that the Quran he held in his hands was identical, word for word, to manuscripts over 1,000 years old. No chapters missing, no edits, no council decisions to include or exclude verses. Unlike the Bible, which had been compiled by committees and altered over centuries, the Quran had remained intact from the time of its revelation. That alone deeply shook William's trust in textual authority. It was no longer about religious preference, it was about historical integrity. One night, while reading Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 164, something shifted inside him. The verse spoke of God's signs in the creation of the heavens and the earth, in the alternation of night and day, in the ships sailing across the seas, in the rain that brings life to the dead earth. It was poetic, but it was also deeply scientific. The Quran wasn't rejecting science, it was inviting it. William was stunned. As someone steeped in the rationalism of Western academia, he had always believed science and religion to be at odds. But here was a book that treated scientific phenomena not as threats, but as signs, proofs of a creator who designed them with wisdom and order. He began to question his own assumptions. Why had he believed for so long that faith must come at the expense of intellect? Why had he assumed that belief was blind while reason was enlightened? The Quran seemed to say the opposite, that true belief was the result of deep reflection, of using one's reason, of contemplating creation with an open heart. It wasn't afraid of being examined. In fact, it demanded it. In a moment of quiet introspection, he came across Surah Al-Ankabut, verse 69. As for those who strive in our cause, we will surely guide them to our ways. And indeed, Allah is with the doers of good. It hit him like a whisper in the dark. This wasn't just a verse, it was a mirror. William realized that his journey wasn't just academic anymore. He had strived, he had questioned, he had challenged. And slowly the Quran had begun to guide him. Not with thunder and lightning, but with clarity and calm. For the first time, William closed the Quran, not with skepticism, but with a strange peace in his heart. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, but deep down he knew. He was no longer fighting the Quran. He was beginning to surrender to it. As months turned into years, William Langford found himself living in two different worlds. By day, he was still a respected Christian theologian, teaching students, writing papers, and speaking at global conferences. But by night, he was a silent seeker, reading the Quran under dim lamplight, translating ancient Arabic verses, and wrestling with questions that no longer had easy answers. His heart had softened, his logic challenged, and his soul stirred. But one question remained. Could he let go of his identity to embrace something he once opposed? He knew that accepting Islam would not just mean embracing a new faith. It would mean losing his position in the academic community, alienating friends, disappointing colleagues, and breaking from a life he had carefully built. For someone who had lectured on the authority of the church for decades, this was not a decision to take lightly. He needed more than intellectual satisfaction. He needed conviction, peace, and guidance from those who lived the path he was now approaching. So in 2009, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He traveled to Cairo, Egypt, to visit Al-Azhar University, one of the oldest and most respected Islamic institutions in the world. There, he hoped to test his findings, engage with Muslim scholars, and either confirm or dismantle what he had come to believe. But instead of fiery debates and scholarly sparring, he encountered something far more disarming: humility. His first meeting was with Sheikh Muhammad al-Hadidi, a soft-spoken, elderly scholar known for his wisdom and grace. William entered the room with a notebook full of questions. But before he could speak, Sheikh al-Hadidi simply smiled and said, "If you are truly seeking the truth, then do not only look with critical eyes, but also with an honest heart." William was taken aback. This was not the start of an intellectual duel. It was a reminder of something deeper. Truth, he realized, was not just a conclusion reached through logic. It was a light, recognized by a heart willing to receive it. For 3 days, William and the Sheikh spoke. They discussed theology, scripture, prophecy, science, ethics. But more than the answers, it was the sheikh's sincerity that moved him. Every response was filled with calmness, not confrontation. Every explanation came with gentleness, not arrogance. And for the first time, William felt what he had never felt before. Not victory in a debate, but humility in discovery. On the last day, as their conversation ended, William sat in silence, unsure of what to say. The sheikh gently placed his hand over William's and said, "Sometimes the door to truth only opens when the heart is ready to walk through it." William didn't reply. He simply nodded, holding back tears. He had spent 15 years trying to refute a book, only to find himself being transformed by it. That night, walking alone through the streets of Cairo, the call to prayer echoed softly in the distance. It didn't sound foreign anymore. It sounded like home. The journey back from Cairo was different, not just in geography, but in soul. Dr. William Langford had left England as a confident Christian apologist, certain of his beliefs, sure of his arguments. But he returned as a man carrying silence inside him, a silence not of confusion, but of awe. Something had shifted, profoundly. He was no longer looking for contradictions in the Quran. He was now seeking a way to live its truths. Back in Manchester, William withdrew from public engagements. He declined lecture invitations, paused his writing projects, and stopped teaching for a while. Friends thought he was just on a break, but within him, a storm of reflection was brewing. In those quiet months, he revisited all the verses that had shaken his certainty. He reread Surah Al-Ikhlas, whose piercing clarity had cut through decades of theological complexity. He pondered Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 2. This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guidance for the God-conscious. And he sat often with verse 9 of Surah Al-Hijr. Indeed, we have sent down the reminder, and indeed, we will preserve it. Each verse echoed with deeper meaning now, not as abstract theology, but as living truth. The Quran was not just a book anymore. It had become his mirror, his teacher, his lifeline. Still, he hesitated. Declaring faith was not just a spiritual decision. It was a worldly one. He knew the backlash would be severe. How could a world-famous Christian professor, known for challenging Islam, now stand with it? He feared for his career, his reputation, his place in the community he had served for decades. And yet, what was the point of recognition if he denied what his heart now knew to be true? One evening, after a long walk in the rain-soaked streets of Manchester, William sat down on his prayer mat, the same mat a Muslim student had gifted him years ago, back when this journey had barely begun. He had never used it before, but that night something broke inside him. The resistance, the pride, the identity he had wrapped around himself, it all dissolved. He whispered, trembling, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Tears poured down his cheeks, not out of sadness but relief. 15 years of intellectual battles, questions, doubt, discovery, all of it had led to this moment of complete surrender. Not to a man, not to an institution, but to the one who had been guiding him all along. News of his conversion eventually leaked, and it spread like wildfire through academic circles. Some were shocked, others furious. A few accused him of betrayal. But William didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He had no need to, because for the first time in his life, he was at peace. Not the kind found in applause or accolades, but the peace that settles in the soul when it finds its creator. Today, Dr. William Langford lives quietly, far from the spotlight. He teaches, but now in different settings. His writings continue, but with a new light. And when asked about his past, he simply smiles and says, I set out to destroy the Quran, but the Quran destroyed my arrogance. I lost a reputation and found myself. He is no longer a man of just knowledge. He is a man of faith, a man of sujud, a man whose heart, once proud, now bows in humility before the one who guided him, verse by verse, step by step, home. In the magnificent and historic auditorium of the University of Salamanca, Spain, an unusual intense event was underway. Hundreds of people from around the world had gathered, drawn by news of a controversial live debate between two religious figures, a Christian priest and a Muslim cleric. The atmosphere buzzed with curiosity, skepticism, and quiet anxiety. Spectators filled every seat, whispering among themselves about the shocking news that preceded the event. At the center of the commotion stood Father John MacArthur, a tall man with a hardened face and a fierce gaze. Known widely for his aggressive stance against Islam, Father MacArthur was not here for an ordinary dialogue. He was here to provoke. With his voice echoing through the hall, he declared, "I want to prove to the world that Islam is a false religion, full of lies and contradictions." His words cut through the air like a knife. Gasps erupted in the crowd as the priest reached beneath his robe and pulled out a copy of the Quran. Without hesitation, he held it high for all to see, then ripped it apart, piece by piece, letting the fragments fall to the ground like ash. "This book is not worth following," he spat. "It misleads billions." Some in the audience were stunned into silence. Others grew visibly angry. Tears welled up in a few eyes. Yet amidst this emotional storm stood a lone figure, serene and still. Ustaz Ahmad al-Farisi. Young, scholarly, and composed, he had been chosen to represent Islam in this critical moment. Dressed modestly and holding a calm demeanor, Ustaz Ahmad did not flinch. He had seen the Quran torn apart in front of him, his faith insulted in the worst way, but his heart remained undisturbed. He understood this was more than a debate. This was a test, not just of his intellect, but of his patience, his character, and the strength of Islam's message. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and whispered in his heart, "I will defend Islam with all my soul." The moderator, struggling to restore order, finally raised his hand and said, "We will begin the formal debate. Let the questions commence." The room fell quiet once more, this time with a heavier silence. Father MacArthur leaned forward with burning eyes and hurled his first question like a spear. "If Allah is all-powerful," he challenged, "then why did he create evil in this world?" There was a beat of silence. All eyes turned to Ustaz Ahmad. This was not an easy question. Philosophers, theologians, and skeptics had debated it for centuries. Yet he stood without hesitation, his voice soft but steady. "The decision to create evil did not come from Allah," he said. "Evil is born from the freedom that Allah gave mankind, to choose between right and wrong. Allah tests his people with both good and bad. Evil exists not because God wills it, but because humans choose it. That is the test of life." The hall remained hushed. Even those unfamiliar with Islam could feel the sincerity in his words. Some nodded quietly. Others exchanged surprised glances. The confidence, wisdom, and calmness of Ustaz Ahmad had just shifted the energy in the room. But this was only the beginning. Father MacArthur, not content with his initial attack, quickly launched his second question, aiming to unsettle Ustaz Ahmad even further. If Muhammad claimed to be the last prophet, why were there other prophets before him? Doesn't that imply that Islam is just another man-made religion? He asked, his voice filled with the confidence of someone who believed they were on solid ground. The audience was silent, eyes fixed on Ustaz Ahmad, who stood calm and composed. His gaze was steady, his hands folded in front of him. He had anticipated this question, one that had been asked countless times before. But this was not a question to be answered with emotion. It required clarity and understanding. Ustaz Ahmad took a deep breath and then spoke with quiet authority. "The fact that previous prophets came before Muhammad does not diminish the truth of Islam. In fact, it affirms it," he began, his voice firm and measured. "Every prophet sent by Allah carried his message for their time and people. But Prophet Muhammad was sent not only to a specific nation, but to the entire world, for all of humanity, for all of time." The clarity in Ustaz Ahmad's voice, the simplicity of his explanation, left no room for doubt. "Islam is the final and universal message from Allah," he continued. "The previous revelations were for their respective communities. But Prophet Muhammad brought the final revelation, one that would guide all people, regardless of race, nation, or time." Father MacArthur, unable to shake Ustaz Ahmad's calmness, pressed on with his next question. He looked at the young cleric with an almost mocking expression and said, "Why do Muslims have so many different interpretations of the Quran? Doesn't this show that the teachings are unclear and ambiguous? How can a religion that claims to be the truth have so many conflicting views? The tension in the room thickened as Ustaz Ahmad took a moment to reflect. He knew this question could undermine the faith of many who did not understand the richness of Islam. With a composed gesture, he stepped forward slightly, his voice unwavering. The differences in interpretation are not a flaw. They are a reflection of the richness and depth of Islam, he said. Islam encourages intellectual engagement and allows for diverse perspectives. The Quran is a divine text, and its meanings are multi-layered. Scholars, over centuries, have studied it in various contexts, drawing upon their understanding of the language, the history, and the culture. He paused, looking around the room. But these differences are based on principles, on the foundation of Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad. While interpretations may differ, the core message remains the same: to believe in one God and to live a life of worship, compassion, and justice. Ustaz Ahmad's words rang with wisdom and confidence, and some members of the audience, who had been skeptical, began to nod in understanding. It was clear that the diversity of interpretations was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of Islam's ability to remain relevant and adaptable across different cultures and generations. Father MacArthur, not willing to give up so easily, raised his next question with renewed intensity. But if Islam is so perfect, why do Muslims still sin? If they truly believe in Allah, why do they fall short? Doesn't this show that Islam is not enough to guide them? The priest's question, though loaded, seemed almost personal, a challenge to the very nature of faith itself. The crowd waited, sensing that this was a critical moment in the debate. But Ustaz Ahmad simply smiled, his expression full of compassion and understanding. He did not take offense. Instead, he responded with clarity. Sin is part of the human condition. We are not perfect beings. Even though we believe in Allah, we are still susceptible to mistakes. But Islam teaches us to seek forgiveness. The core of Islam is not about being sinless, but about turning to Allah in repentance when we fall short. Allah is the most merciful, and He forgives those who sincerely seek His forgiveness. There was a gentle yet powerful sincerity in His words. The truth was simple but profound. Humans are imperfect, but Islam offers a path to redemption through repentance and mercy. Father MacArthur, now visibly frustrated, was determined to land a final blow. Why do Muslims believe that God is childless? Why do they insist that God has no family? Isn't that an impossibility? If God is all-loving, why wouldn't He have a family? The priest's voice grew louder as he sought to challenge the very nature of God in Islam. The audience waited, anticipating Ustaz Ahmad's response to this direct and philosophical question. Father MacArthur, though visibly shaken by the firm and clear responses so far, was determined not to show weakness. He took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and launched his third question. His voice rose slightly in volume, clearly aiming to stir doubt among the audience. If the Quran is so clear and perfect, he said, why do Muslims have so many different interpretations of it? Doesn't that prove ambiguity and inconsistency in your religion? There was a brief murmur among the audience. It was a question that many had pondered, even Muslims themselves at times. Ustaz Ahmad didn't rush. He looked at the crowd, then at Father MacArthur, and replied with a composed tone, differences in interpretation are not a weakness of Islam. They are a reflection of its richness. The Quran was revealed with universal truths, and scholars over centuries have studied it deeply, using their knowledge, context, and sincerity. He continued, as long as the interpretations stay within the framework of the Quran and Hadith, they are a mercy, not a contradiction. The diversity of thought within Islam is a blessing from Allah. We are not robots, we are thinkers, and Allah has honored us with intellect and reason. The crowd was visibly moved. Some who had doubted Islam's internal coherence began to appreciate its intellectual depth and flexibility. But Father MacArthur wasn't done. He leaned forward, more aggressive now, and said, then tell me this. If Muslims believe in Allah and the Quran, why do they still sin? Shouldn't faith in a perfect God prevent them from wrongdoing? A few audience members nodded in curiosity. Ustaz Ahmad smiled gently, as if anticipating the question. We are human, he said. Belief doesn't make us flawless. Islam doesn't claim that believers are sinless. It teaches that Allah is most forgiving. Faith gives us awareness of right and wrong, but mistakes are part of the human condition. The key is repentance and striving to improve. The answer hit deep. It was honest, relatable, and filled with humility. Even some non-Muslims in the audience found themselves quietly agreeing. And once again, Father MacArthur found his attack met not with defensiveness, but with dignity and reason. Father MacArthur's frustration was beginning to show. The confidence that had once radiated from his posture was slowly being replaced by visible tension. His brow furrowed, and his fingers gripped the edges of the podium tightly. He took a moment, then hurled what he believed was one of his most powerful challenges. "Is God really childless?" he asked, his voice sharp and defiant. "Why are Muslims so convinced that God has no family? Isn't love a part of divinity? If God is truly loving, why wouldn't he have a son?" Gasps rippled through the hall. The question was bold, personal, and deeply theological. But Ustaz Ahmad showed no sign of disturbance. He stepped forward slightly and answered in a firm, steady voice. "Because God is not like his creation. Allah is one. He is eternal. He begets not, nor is he begotten. He has no partners, no equals, and no need." He paused, letting the words settle. Love in Islam is not limited to human forms like parenthood. Allah's love is perfect and beyond limits. He provides, forgives, guides, and nurtures all creation without ever needing a child. To give God human attributes is to limit him. The audience fell into a deep, thoughtful silence. Some had never heard such a simple yet powerful explanation before. The Christian concept of divine sonship had long been a pillar for many, but hearing Ustaz Ahmad's reasoning stirred a different kind of reflection. Ustaz Ahmad continued gently. "The idea that God needs a son to show love reduces his majesty. Allah loves perfectly, without sharing his divinity with anyone." Father MacArthur opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. The certainty he once carried now appeared cracked. His earlier attacks had been met not with hostility, but with quiet strength. In that moment, a shift occurred in the auditorium, not just in the debate, but in the hearts of the people. The priest who had entered with confidence now stood face to face with a truth that was clearer, deeper, and more unshakable than he had expected. And Ustaz Ahmad, still standing with grace and humility, waited silently, knowing the next question would decide everything. Father MacArthur, now visibly unsettled, decided to ask one final question, one he hoped would once and for all prove his point. He stood up straighter, his tone more forceful, as he posed his question to Ustaz Ahmad, the room hanging on his every word. "If God is truly all-powerful and all-loving," Father MacArthur said, "then why does he allow suffering in the world? Why is there war, poverty, hunger, and so much pain? If Allah truly cares for his creation, why does he allow such evil to exist?" The question echoed in the room. For a brief moment, the audience was completely still, as if holding their breath. It was a question that many people, regardless of their faith, had struggled with. The question of suffering had troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries. Ustaz Ahmad, however, was ready. He looked directly at Father MacArthur, his expression calm, yet filled with profound conviction. "The suffering in this world is not a sign of God's failure," he said, his voice steady but deep. "This world is a place of testing, not the final destination. Allah has created this life as a temporary trial, where every person's faith, patience, and perseverance are tested," he continued, his words flowing with a deep sense of wisdom. "It is through hardship that we grow. If there were no suffering, there would be no opportunity for compassion, no call to help those in need. The suffering we face teaches us resilience, patience, and empathy. And in the face of these trials, Allah is with us, guiding us and offering us a reward in the hereafter for our endurance." The silence in the room was palpable. Many in the audience were visibly moved by Ustaz Ahmad's words. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted, and they began to see suffering not as a punishment from Allah, but as a part of the human experience, something that could lead to growth, wisdom, and ultimately, eternal reward. Father MacArthur, who had been so sure of his stance, stood frozen. The answer had not only diffused his question, but had also revealed a truth he hadn't anticipated. His heart, once filled with certainty, now began to waver. He stood there, looking at Ustaz Ahmad, his mind racing. Finally, with a trembling voice, Father MacArthur said, I don't know what to say. You've given me much to think about. Ustaz Ahmad nodded gently. That's all I ask, Father, to seek the truth with an open heart.